over this past weekend, one of the most high-profile Republican governors in the entire country vanished. It happened again. He disappeared, gone, just out of the blue. Nobody in his state knew exactly where he was. This was the publicly available schedule for Republican Governor Rick Scott of Florida. Every weekend he's been governor up to this past weekend included some sort of event, even if it was just church services listed on Sunday. But then this past weekend, that's it. Nothing. Nothing on the calendar for Saturday, nothing on the calendar for Sunday, not even church. Given the very recent history of Republican governors just up and disappearing from their states, only to return with lots of explaining to do, political reporters in Florida started getting curious. They started asking questions about where Rick Scott went. And when they asked Rick Scott's office about the governor's whereabouts, they were told, frankly, that they should consult the official schedule. The official schedule, which again showed absolutely nothing. So after days of wondering what the heck was going on with their disappearing governor, today Florida residents and those Florida political reporters finally got some answers. They finally got the truth about where their governor was this past weekend, what he was doing that mysteriously was listed as blank on his public schedule. Turns out Rick Scott, the new Republican governor of Florida, was at a secret invitation-only retreat outside of Vail, Colorado, put on by the billionaire Koch brothers. After declaring a state of emergency in Florida due to wildfires, Governor Rick Scott hopped on a plane. He went to Colorado. He addressed this secret Koch brothers retreat and apparently hoped that nobody back home would notice. Unfortunately for Governor Scott, they did notice. At the same time that Rick Scott went missing in Florida, though, another Republican governor went missing, too. Republican Governor Rick Perry of Texas. In order to figure out where Rick Perry had gone, the local press in Texas resorted to, I'm not kidding, tracking the tail number of a private plane that Rick Perry was sometimes known to use, the private plane of one of Rick Perry's major campaign donors. And it turns out that Rick Perry, too, had been meeting with the Koch brothers at their private retreat outside of Vail, Colorado. Rick Perry and Rick Scott were not the only Republican governors that were attending this super secret Koch brothers confab this past weekend. Also on the list, Republican Governor Bob McDonnell of Virginia. In fact, Bob McDonnell's part of the reason that anybody knew this secret retreat was happening in the first place, because he, unlike Rick Scott at least, put the meeting on his schedule. Just as a refresher, the Koch brothers are the super rich, super politically active heirs to the Koch Industries fortune. Koch Industries is an oil and chemical conglomerate that Charles and David Koch inherited from dear old dad. Koch Industries is the second largest privately held company in the entire country. Charles and David Koch have lobbied aggressively for years and years to kill regulations on the industry that has made them so rich, to kill regulations on the oil and chemical industry. The way they've gotten politically active is by doing things like funding efforts to defeat climate science and by bankrolling the opposition to clean energy in the United States. Koch Industries has reportedly spent more than $48 million on that effort just since 1997. And it's not just funding opposition to clean energy and energy regulation. It's also key, and this is key, that they've been putting the politicians in place that they want to push through their agenda. Nearly all of the 31 Republicans on the House Energy Committee can cite Koch Industries as one of their top corporate donors. 9 of the 12 new members of that panel signed a pledge by the Koch brothers group Americans for Prosperity to oppose any efforts by the Obama administration to regulate greenhouse gases at all. That is how the Koch brothers operate in our politics. That's why the Koch brothers, frankly, have become this year's liberal boogeyman, right? That's why even people who aren't liberals tend to think of guys like this as boogeymen. People flexing this much political muscle for those types of political aims, for their own corporate self-interest, is sort of hard to market to the public at large. It is sort of a hard sell. So even as individual Republican politicians want as much of that Koch brothers money as they can get their hands on, and they're happy to fly to Vail, Colorado to go meet with them and get their marching orders and try to lock up some of that money, frankly, even while you are doing that, you try to keep that private plane tail number out of the Austin American-Statesman. You try to keep that sort of trip off your public schedule. But as unpopular as associating with the Koch brothers might be for these individual politicians, as embarrassing as it may be to get outed secretly traveling to a Koch brothers summit in Colorado over a weekend when you want everybody to just not wonder where you are, The Koch brothers have been making it worth these politicians' while. And how? Both through cold, hard cash and through support for policy positions, certain policy positions, once they are in office. Many of these Republican governors have the Koch brothers to thank, in part, for winning their races. In 2010 alone, Koch Industries and its employees and subsidiaries spent $1.2 million getting Republican governors elected across the country. Koch Industries was the single largest source of corporate contributions for Republican Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin. And he wasn't even the governor they gave the most to. They gave more money to Rick Perry of Texas than they gave to Scott Walker. They also supported, surprise, surprise, Republican Governor John Kasich in Ohio. If you are a Republican politician associating yourself with the Koch brothers, going to their secret meetings in Vail, it helps you get elected. But it doesn't just buy you support for your campaign. It also buys you support for your specific policies as well, even policies that are likely to be really unpopular. If you are Scott Walker in Wisconsin, for example, Koch-affiliated groups will hold rallies at your state capitol to support your pro-corporate union stripping thing. They will even ship Sarah Palin in from Alaska to speak at the event. If you are John Kasich of Ohio, don't worry, they will help bankroll your union stripping thing as well. Governor Kasich's big union stripping bill is facing the possibility of being overturned by Ohio voters in November. Who's got John Kasich's back in defending that bill? Who's helping to finance the union busting side of that fight? The Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, of course. Koch brothers have the backs of all of these Republican governors in all of these states who are taking up all of these unpopular fights. And they are helping those governors succeed in the next election, not just by trying to persuade people of the rightness of their cause, but by also simply just reducing the number of likely Democratic voters that might make it to the polls and who are allowed to vote. All over the country, in almost every red state, we are seeing these Koch Industries-supported governors changing the voting rules. There's no outcry in these states to change the voting rules, but these Republican governors are doing it anyway. They are making it harder to register to vote and harder to actually vote. Scott Walker already signed his big voter ID bill into law in Wisconsin back in May. Republican Governor Paul LePage in Maine is right now trying to eliminate his state's same-day voter registration law. He signed a law into effect that would do that. Voters in Maine have signaled that they will try to exercise their people's veto over that. They will try to recall what Governor LePage just did. Republican Governor John Kasich of Ohio is now waiting on a tough new voter ID law that even the Republican Secretary of State in Ohio has come out against, saying it will result in real legally cast ballots not being counted and of real legally registered voters not being allowed to vote. All of these Republican voters, all of these Republican governors are pushing all of these laws that will make it dramatically harder to register to vote and to actually vote. Dramatic changes to voter registration rolls and voting rolls that are expected to reduce the number of Democratic-leaning voters in constituencies like minorities and the poor and disabled people and young people. In addition to changing the voting rules to decrease the number of Democrats who will be expected to vote, these Koch Industries supporter governors are also targeting the single biggest organizational asset that Democrats have in the states. Today, New Jersey's Republican Governor Chris Christie signed into law his big union stripping bill, which is the landmark achievement of his time in office so far. Tomorrow, Scott Walker's big union stripping law will officially go into effect in Wisconsin after months and months of legal struggles and struggles in the streets. John Kasich in Ohio has already signed his new union stripping law into effect. In terms of winning elections, in terms of dismantling Democratic hopes of winning elections, killing the unions is really how you do it, is the best organizational structure that Democrats have had. Organizational structure in the way that they could turn on their get-out-the-vote operation was once a huge advantage of the National Republican Party. That advantage has now sort of disappeared. We saw that firsthand in Nevada during the last election when we went there to cover the Harry Reid, Sharon Angle Senate race last year. And we spoke with political reporter John Ralston. What's the Sharon Angle turnout infrastructure? If the Republican Party isn't all that here, what is she relying on for turning out votes?
Karl Rove, American Crossroads, announced a few weeks ago that they were going to dump a bunch of money into Nevada to help them with Get Out the Vote. And so they have poured some money, my understanding is, into the Nevada Republican Party, which essentially is a shell corporation. There's nothing there. And that they're then using that to mail to people negative read mailers and probably for phone banking. And so how much they've actually come through, we don't know on the reports yet.
Can you really fly in and get out the vote infrastructure? Doesn't it have to be based here? Doesn't it have to be organic?
I think not only does it have to be organic to be effective, but it can't be done in just a few weeks.
Because the Republican Party's get out the vote capacity has been allowed to atrophy in recent years, it is now being supplemented by these private and secretly funded outside groups like the one run by Karl Rove. Last year's elections were really the first elections where they tried to pull that off. Nevada is one of the places where it seems like they just didn't get it together fast enough to do it. But it looks like they're not going to make that same mistake this time around. Roll Call newspaper reporting today that another one of these types of groups, Freedom Works, is now beginning to transition itself from an activist organization to a get out the vote organization. As it is, get out the vote is traditionally done by the political parties, but that, of course, involves abiding by those pesky federal restrictions on how much parties can take in from groups and individuals for those activities. Take that responsibility out of the hands of the parties and give it to someone like Freedom Works, and hey, there go all the restrictions. As the Obama re-election campaign really gets into gear now, one of the things that I think Democrats are often sort of smug and satisfied about is the superiority of their own party structure, their own organizational structure, their own ability to reach their own voters and encourage them to go out and vote when it counts. Well, Democrats have been building up that structural capacity, and the Obama administration was very good at it in 2008, the Obama organization, I should say. Republicans, in terms of the Republican Party, they have been letting their organizational efforts languish, as seen in Nevada, where the Democratic effort was very well organized and the Republican effort was not. And therefore, even though all the polls showed Sharon Engel winning that race, when it came to Election Day, the Democrats actually came out on top. But we now know that Republicans have been letting that capacity atrophy within the party while instead planning on it being done by outside groups. By being done by Karl Rove's groups or Freedom Works or the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity. That stuff, that organizational capacity, will now be handled through means that can be 100% corporate funded to an unlimited degree. If Freedom Works is now going to be doing the get out the vote efforts for Republican candidates, who are the donors to Freedom Works? Really, who are their donors? You don't know. I don't know. They don't have to tell us. If China or Brazil decides that they like one of the Republican presidential contenders this year and they would prefer that person to Barack Obama, what's to stop China or Brazil from giving $1 million to Freedom Works to go get out the vote, to go do organizational work for that candidate? What's to stop them from giving $1 million donation or a $10 million donation or a $10 billion donation? Literally, what is to stop China from writing a $10 billion check to elect some favored Republican candidate in the next election? To elect some favored Republican candidate the next president of the United States. What's to stop that now? I will ask the man who invented the 50-state strategy for the Democratic Party, former DNC party chairman Howard Dean, next.